Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to this online talk organized by the research scholars of the School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies, Goa University. Our speaker for today is Dr. Palak. Few announcements before we begin. This talk, along with the contents here, which is for around 60 minutes, followed by a Q&A session. I now request Akash to introduce the speaker and deliver the welcome address.
Thank you, Tia. Good afternoon to all, and a very warm welcome for this online lecture titled Freud and Feminism by Dr. Palak Mittal. Dr. Palak Mittal is a PhD in philosophy from University of Delhi. In her doctoral thesis, Concept of Sexuality, the Feminist Theory and Alternative Perspectives, through a comparison between the feminist thinkers' viewpoints on sexuality and that of Freud, Gandhi, and Eva Needham. She attempts to question how gender differences take shape through an understanding of sexuality. Since 2014, Dr. Mittal has been teaching philosophy as a visiting and guest faculty in various colleges under University of Delhi, like Hindu College, Deshbandhu College, Kamla Nehru College, and Ramanujan College. Her research interests include Indian philosophy, feminism, Gandhian philosophy, and gender theory. She has published and presented on the same in peer-reviewed and reference journals and national and international seminars. I would like to welcome Dr. Palak Mittal for this online guest lecture. I would also like to welcome the Dean of School of Sanskrit Philosophy and Indic Studies, Professor Koshi Tarakan, and all the faculties and research scholars of the department. I would also like to welcome all the other faculties, students, and participants from university and outside. Welcome everyone. I please call upon Dr. Palak Mittal to start the talk.
So, thank you so much, Akash, for such a wonderful introduction. And I hope I'm audible to everybody. Am I?
Yes,
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, okay. So once again, thank you, Sia and Akash, for such a lovely introduction. And my heartfelt, I'm extremely grateful that that all of you are here and we could have this discussion today. And so I think let me just tell you what am I going to talk about before I start. So my PhD thesis is on the concept of sexuality, and I have looked at it from the feminist perspective along with the key thinkers like Sigmund Freud, Ivan Illich, and Mahatma Gandhi. And today's talk is I'm going to present one of the chapters of my PhD thesis. So I'm going to talk about Freud and the feminist thinkers. I'm going to talk about the concept of desire, like how it is the key concept in Freud's philosophy, and how it is also important in feminism, and how these feminist thinkers are talking about it, and where do both of them, Freud and feminist, come together? Like, do they have any similarities, or they do not? Whether they have any similarities, whether they have a common ground, or they do not have any common ground. And for this, I have chosen three feminist thinkers, which are Simone de Beauvoir, Judith Butler, and Luce Irigaray. So, what I would do is, as I've been told that the presentation, my talk would be for around 60 minutes, I am planning to share a PPT with you. And while sharing the PPT, I would be giving my lecture. There are the key points in the PPT. And then I'll be giving the lecture along with it. Once I am done with my lecture, I think the podium would be open for quick Q&A. So please write down the questions or any suggestions if you have. Like, that would be, I would really love to hear your feedback, your suggestions. If you have any contributions to make, that how can I make this what do you say, this research even better, or something you would like to add to it, please do so freely, and I would definitely, I'm looking forward to it. So without further ado, I'll start my presentation. So I'll just share the screen with you all. One second. Can you see the screen now? Um, Is the screen visible to everyone? Is the PPT
Yeah,
visible?
yeah, the PPT is visible now.
All right. So what I'll do is I'll just
Yes.
I'll okay. So I'll just switch off the camera. So 1 second. Okay. Am I audible and the screen is visible to everyone? Is the PPT visible?
Yes, yeah, it's visible.
Okay.
Yes.
Please allow me a second. All right. So I'm audible to everybody, right? Can I start now? May I start?
Yes, ma'am. Please start.
Yes, yes.
Okay. So good afternoon once again, everybody, and let's start the talk. As you can see, this is the first chapter of my PhD thesis. The chapter has been titled as The Concept of Desire, Freud and the Feminist. And I've titled today's talk as Freud and Feminism. So what actually like I have done in this chapter is so the psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, who actually predates all the feminist thinkers in the discourse of sexuality, as we all know, he excavates a layer of sexual dimensions to show how psychosexuality always leads to sexuality. So for him it begins from the psychosexuality, and he feels that how it always leads to sexuality. So he's somebody who has worked out with plenty of depth he has worked out the part which that sexual instinct he has worked out that part in which sexual instinct plays in every the sexual instinct plays an important role in every phase of human life. So in a nutshell, if I have to say, I would say that Freud's concept of the instincts, and it attributes every human impulse right from the birth to his or her desire to attain and augment sexual pleasure. So in a way, Freud postulates that all human behavior is driven by desire, more specifically the desire for pleasure. That's what Freud says. Freud explains that the stages of psychosexual development, he says it's right from infancy to adulthood, which forms the foundation of his work. So he argues that that children have sexual urges, from which adult sexuality kind of gradually emerges via psychosexual development. He states that that the sexual tension promotes development from infancy through adulthood. So I feel that it is interesting as well as important to read Freud along with the feminist thinkers, as the latter take the nature versus nurture approach to categorize sex and gender, and the former, which is Freud, he disputes the binary classification. Freud rather is the opinion that that this innate sexual urge in an individual, it sort of supersedes the emotional and physiological in shaping one's gender identity. Being in such sharp contrast to traditional feminist beliefs, Freud's theories are important in exploring alternate possibilities when it comes to the development of gender and sexual identities. And an attempt is being made in this chapter to, to make a comparative analysis of Freud's notion of sexuality with those of feminist thinkers. And the key feminist thinkers I've chosen for my work are Simone de Beauvoir, Luce Irigaray, and Judith Butler. So, in a way, it is an attempt to understand Freud's conception of sexuality and to see if he has any contribution to make to the feminist theory. So now there are various thinkers. Like before we go on with this, like there are various thinkers who have already sort of evaluated Freud's theory of sexuality. And amongst the major feminist thinkers, I think Juliet Michel and Nancy Chodorow are two of the few who have noteworthy insights on the Freudian notion of sexuality. And of the many contemporary of Freud, I think Karen Horney and Ernest Jones are two celebrated names who have kind of provided an essential critique of his concepts. So I believe to have a kind of holistic approach, or to have a holistic perspective rather, on Freud's theories, it is imperative to study the views and opinions of these thinkers along with them. So just to give you a little sneak peek about what these thinkers are saying. So basically, Juliet Michel, in her book is titled Psychoanalysis and Feminism. And she takes a very empathetic view than most of the thinkers on Freud's concepts regarding women and sexuality. While for many, they find that, that his ideas to be patriarchal in nature, but Juliet Michel, she considers them to be commentary on patriarchal society itself. So she believes that the similarities which Freud recognizes between pre-Oedipal boys and girls are, according to Michel, the consequence of the freedom of identity that both boys and girls possess before they are distinguished as per patriarchal categories. So Michel's view is akin to the psychological impact of social oppression on women, who tend to internalize and subconsciously believe that they inherently belong in a subordinate position to men in society. And Michelle, she feels that that the young girl, they sort of suffer in the Oedipal stage on discovering that she's penisless and hence not worthy of a mother, and how she subsequently internalizes an inferiority complex, which she is saying that this is because of the psychological impact of social oppression on women. And this is how Michelle sort of tried to find common ground between feminism and psychoanalysis in a time when most felt they were at odds with each other. Moving on to Nancy Chodorow. Nancy Chodorow has kind of a more, I would say, nuanced view of Freud's theory on sexuality. And she sort of talks about how it leads to the development of a gendered society. She sees both merits and demerits in his arguments. For example, she agrees with Freud when he asserts that the boy goes through the Oedipal phase earlier than the girl, and that enables his escape from the influence of mother. Wherever she disagrees with Freud in his assessment of this thing having a constructive effect on the boy. So, in Chodrow's opinion, the detachment of the boy from his mother develops strong anti-feminine feelings in him. So, this is the kind of thing Chodrow's talking about. So, basically, I'm just talking about these thinkers because they are kind of important. So, I have mentioned them in my work, and I thought I'll just briefly kind of take you into it. Next two thinkers which I've looked at are Karen Horney and Ernest Jones. So, basically, Horney focused more on how the conscious mind plays a role in human personality, not just subconscious repression. In particular, Horney argued for an inherent feminine disposition that is not merely a secondary sort of formation premised on castration. And she took, in Karen Horney, she took issue with the ostensible effects of penis envy and women supposed feelings of inferiority. And when we come to Ernest Jones, Jones in his work maintains that women do not suffer from deep-rooted insecurities regarding her lack of a male sexual organ, and that it does dictate how she views herself as theorized by Freud. And Jones further sort of suggests that the purpose of the theory of penis envy serves nothing but to defend the castration complex. That's what Jones is talking about. So moving on, so we can, I think, kind of conclude that that the different views to sexuality on sexuality emerge when we study the views of feminist thinkers and Freud's contemporaries. So they were all Freud's contemporaries who I just talked about. However, both of them are important and form an important ground for us to attain a deeper understanding of Freud's theories. That's why I thought it's like I would sort of discuss them briefly. And given that we have studied the critiques of Freud's theories, and now we can study in detail, now we can talk further about the Freud's notion of sexuality and how I take it down further along with the feminist thinker. That's the main core work of my thesis. So just telling you briefly, when you talk about Freud's notion of sexuality, the two important terms which Freud kind of uses in his work to explain the theory of sexuality are object and goal. So for him, both object and goal are the important elements of an individual's sexual drive. So, the person executing the sexual attraction is termed as a sexual object, and the action towards which the drive urges an individual is the sexual goal. So, the sexual object is defined as an object of desire, and the sexual goal is the sexual act that one desires to perform with that object. So, these two terms are very important in Freud's theory: sexual object and sexual goal. So, moving on to infantile sexuality, basically, infantile sexuality forms the basis and leads to developing the notion of sexuality in individuals, according to Freud. And at the same time, it is required that the repression be compounded for the development of sexuality in females. So, coming to first coming to infantile sexuality, then we'll go to the femininity and or the female sexuality. So, basically, infantile sexuality. What basically Freud is talking about over here is that I could say that divergent to the general belief that sexual drive is non-existent in childhood and only develops during puberty. Freud advocates that as children grow, they evolve through a succession of phases. According to Freud, during each of the psychosexual phases, like he has named five phases. He says that everybody goes through these five phases, which is oral, anal, phallic, latency, and genital. I'll explain what these five phases are. And he's saying that right from the time a baby is born, he goes through these, like all of us go through these five phases right from our childhood until puberty, and how these five phases are very important, and these are termed as the psychosexual stages in his theory. So, and he feels that if the successful navigation through these five stages, it kind of forms the core of sexual development in human beings. So the stages of psychosexual development as put forth by Freud are as follows. Like the first one is oral stage. So why is it called the oral stage? The first stage is called the oral stage because it occurs right from birth until the age of 1 year in an individual. In this stage, as per Freud, the libido is placed in the mouth of a baby. A baby tries to satisfy its libido by placing things in his mouth, as this stage is mouth oriented. Okay, so he further explains that like he has given examples of activities like thumb sucking, biting, breastfeeding. So he's saying he drives attention to the sexual nature of these activities and considers them as a form of sexual expression and one of the essential traits of infantile sexual activity. All children do not engage in thumb sucking, and those who do are those in whom the erogenous significance of the labial zones is, sort of it lies in the mouth. So he's saying that that he contends that the labial zone is twofold in nature. On one hand, if its significance is preserved, it could lead to an oral fixation in later life. For example, smoking, nail biting, finger chewing, or thumb sucking in a person. An individual with an oral personality specifically gets engrossed in these activities, mainly under stress. On the other hand, if repression intervenes, then it could affect the alimentary drive and lead to an aversion to food in later years, sometimes resulting in things like globus hysterica, which is like lumps in the throat or some sort of eating difficulty. So it is kind of important to resolve every stage as an individual group. So he's saying that so this marks the end of the first stage of psychosexual development in an individual, and now once he progresses from this stage, he goes on to the second stage, which is the anal stage. So in this stage, it occurs between the age of 1 to 3 years, and what happens over here is the libido is placed in the anus of a child, and he gets great sort of gratification from defecation, and he explains that the children who are allowed to sort of like they were put a lot of pressure, like they were trained, and they were this kind of, if the authority was very, if the parent were very strict, and a child who like sort of hold in his feces and gets a lot of pressure from his parents or guardians to get rid of it may develop anal repulsive fixation or personality upon growing up. He or she can get very obsessed with cleanliness, punctuality, and can turn out to become a control freak. Whereas a child who went under liberal toilet training develops an expulsive personality. Since there were no restrictions imposed during the anal stage, these children can turn out to be very liberal, confident, careless, and artistic in their adulthood. So this is the end of second stage. Then he comes to the third stage, which is the phallic stage, and which is very important in Freud's notion of sexuality. So he says that this occurs between the 3 to 6 years of age, and the libido is centered in the genitals of a child now, and he becomes attentive to anatomical sex distinctions. So Freud believes that the Oedipus complex is the pivotal event of the sexual phase of the early years of an individual, which takes place during this stage. So I'm not sure if some of you have heard of Oedipal complex, which is an important theory in Freud's notion of sexuality, and where he's saying that as per Freud, Oedipus complex is that stage which when the child becomes aware of her or his anatomical dissimilarity, which has a psychological impact on her or him in terms of their gender identity. So it is during this stage that the libido is seen to be attached to the image of parental figures. Okay. So as a child feels sexually attracted towards a parent of the opposite sex and envious of the parent of the same sex. So the Oedipus complex occurs in a boy when he cultivates unconscious sensual wishes towards his mother. The boy starts to desire his mother and develops sort of hostile impulses against his father and wishes to get rid of him to take his place with his mother. The unpleasant feelings towards the father give rise to castration anxiety in the boy. It is an inexplicable but deep rooted fear that his father will punish him with castration. Freud advocates that the boy deals with this fear by identifying himself with his father and tries to mold himself in his image. Whereas the identification with the father helps a boy to dissolve his Oedipus complex, leading to him attaining his superego and merging the masculinity in his character. It helps him in sort of developing an affectionate relationship with the mother rather than one based on sexual attraction, which is now directed towards other women. Whereas when if you talk about Oedipus complex in girls, I think it is very differently navigated in girls than in boys, according to Freud, because he says that on discovering that a girl, like when a girl sort of discovers that she cannot be provided with a penis by the mother, the girl develops what is called penis envy. Okay, so the female equivalent of the castration complex is called penis envy, and she rejects her mother as a love object, and her sexual attention is then directed towards her father. Now, this process of abandoning her original love object, the mother, and it poses a greater difficulty for her than it does for a boy. A boy's castration complex is dissolved when he enters the Oedipus phase, whereas for the girl, it is the other way around. So, like the process of a girl's development of femininity in Freud's theory is a complex one, as there are a lot more factors that come into play when compared to that of the development of a boy's masculinity. Okay. So, all these factors and the process of the manifestation of femininity in a girl have been discussed in greater detail. Like I will be discussing it in the next section. So, this kind of brings us to the end of the third stage of psychosexual development, which is the phallic stage. Moving on to the fourth stage, latency stage. This is termed as latency stage because it begins between the ages of 5 or 6 and it lasts until puberty. So there is no more psychosexual development during this phase. The libido is latent or set back throughout the latency period. During this period in a child's life, her or his energy is directed towards gaining new skills or hobbies. She or he get busy with schooling or other activities with other children maybe of the same age. So as a consequence, the psychosexual development of a child remains in a dormant sort of state from here till the end of the latency stage, which is which is marked by the child, you could say, entering puberty. So the child now progresses into the final stage, the genital stage. Now, what is that? So this is the last phase of the psychosexual development of an individual, which somewhere begins with puberty, because that's where the previous stage ends, which is the latency stage, and determines the definitive formation of sexual life. This phase marks the beginning of the pubertal phase of development. According to Freud, the appropriate passage of sexual drive in adulthood can only be attained through heterosexuality. That's what Freud says. An individual during this phase makes sexual contact with people of the opposite gender outside the family. They move on from the sexual attraction they had for their opposite sex parent in the phallic stage, and the pleasure is gained through actual sexual intercourse with the partner. If there are any fixations and conflicts developed during any of the psychosexual stages, which we have just talked about, like oral, anal, phallic, then then they might inhibit it. Like they might sort of come in between. So well, otherwise, if like all goes good, then the object choice made in puberty must renounce the infantile objects and start over again as a sensual current. So this marks the end of the last stage of psychosexual development. So we can kind of say that that sexuality is not merely limited merely to the act of copulation, according to Freud. It could be even inferred that Freud broadens the concept of sexuality from being solely kind of connected with one's sexual organs, and he's kind of linking it to the psychological development. So I would say Freud builds a strong association, between sexuality and the aim of deriving pleasure. thereby, kind of relegating the act of reproduction to a secondary position. And subsequently, he links that desire for pleasure with the nature of all the relationships and emotions one encounters in an attempt to gain insights into overall human behavior. So Freud further on goes on to emphasize that, that whatever may be the sexual identity one assumes in life eventually, it is rooted in the sexual development that is catalyzed by infantile sexuality. So these stages are very important. So this infantile sexuality and the desires and conflicts it manifests are a crucial part of the foundation upon which Freud's theory on sexuality and desire are built upon. So from infancy, like from the right from when a human being is an infant, from being an infant to adulthood, each one of the stages of the psychosexual development, as discussed just now, they play a critical part in molding an individual's masculinity or femininity. The latter of which we shall discuss further now, the femininity part. So well, in this section, I've talked about how the sexual development of women is not analogous to men in Freud's theory of sexuality. He refers to it as the riddle of femininity. The fact that he considered it as a riddle, why? Because he reveals that he viewed a person's sexual identity not as a biological predefined characteristic. Instead, he refers to it as a process of an individual realizing one's sexual differences through a series of interactions between bodily drives and other familiar factors. Well, to explain it in a better way, Freud kind of begins with the experiences which one faces right from childhood to understand the development of femininity in a girl child. And the two important theories which he refers to while explaining the coming about of femininity in women are of castration and Oedipus complex. Okay, so it is these two phenomena that form the mystery of Freud's femininity riddle. He seems perplexed, by how girls abandon their love object, which is their mother, and instead take their father as an object. And he sort of attempts to understand it in his theory, and he proposes that that the Oedipal complex roots differently for the boy and the girl child. And he says that in boys, the Oedipus complex is destroyed by the castration complex. In girls, it is made possible, led up to by the castration complex. So the castration complex resolves the Oedipal complex in boys, but its effects on girls could be manifold. So according to Freud, the Oedipal complex could maybe lead her towards the cessation of her whole sexual life, or B, direct her to cling with defiant, sort of self-assertion to her threatened masculinity, or even lead her towards the beginning of final femininity. So it is only in the third very complex, in the tortuous path of development that ends up in the final normal feminine attitude, which chooses the father as its object and thus arrives at the female form of the Oedipus complex. So in a way, Freud is postulating over here that, in women, then the Oedipus complex is the result of a longer development, and it is not destroyed by the influence of castration, but rather created by it. And too often, female does not overcome it at all. So the pre-Oedipal attachment of a girl to her mother plays a significant role, and the changing of her love object from the mother to the father does not fare easily for a girl. So this shift from the mother to the father is not a result of fear, but contempt and envy for what her mother lacks. A penis also contributes to this deviation. Since she realizes that she is already castrated, she does not consider her father as a threat. Neither does she view him as a desire to be fulfilled at a stage in the future, as she feels the only way she can compensate for a lack of a penis when she is given the opportunity by another man to have a child of her own. So this is in a stark contrast, if we look at it, to a boy's relationship with his father, who he can identify with, and who is someone he hopes to emulate. So the acknowledgement of castration by a girl somewhere also reflects her acceptance of this superiority of a man over her, leading her to feel inferior. And this accounts in Freud's view for the girl's weaker superegos and lower sublimation ability. Since the Oedipus complex is brought about by the castration complex, it is quite possible that a girl does not overcome it fully. Thus, it is this difference in the reciprocal relationship between the Oedipus complex and the castration complex that shapes the woman as a social being, and a girl's navigation of the Oedipal complex leads her to a femininity that is defined as being the object of male desire. Hence, it can be seen, like how crucial Freud's opinion on femininity are. They are particularly unique since he differentiates gender and femininity, emphasizing that the latter is not affected merely by the biological and psychological, but also by several social and cultural factors. And Freud goes on to assert that fear of castration is present in both the girl and boy child. This occurrence seems obvious in the case of a boy because, upon learning that he's competing with his father for his mother's affection, he begins to fear that his father would castrate him as punishment. In the case of a girl, this fear of castration is harder to understand since they're already penisless. So, but as Freud explains, this fear is a form that envy takes, and a girl, upon realizing that she does not possess this valuable asset, holds her mother responsible and directs her attention towards her father. So we can say that one has to sort of study it through the prism of psychoanalysis to comprehend the issue of sexuality at a broader level, such Freud's views on infantile sexuality and femininity, as we have just discussed, kind of provide us the for the basis, they sort of provide the basis for comparing and contrasting his theory with those of feminists chosen for my study, which shall be discussed now. So the thinkers which I have chosen for my study are Simone de Beauvoir, Luce Irigaray, and Judith Butler. Starting with Simone de Beauvoir. So now, when I tried to look at Freud and Simone de Beauvoir together, when I tried to, while comparing the works of both Freud and Simone de Beauvoir, a key similarity which I found was that, between the two of them is their shared belief that women are not born, but rather made. Okay, so, however, the reasonings for the same are different. Like, as there are different views on many other subjects as well. So, like, Sigmund Freud believes that a boy and a girl start from the same stage pre-deeply, and they're being attached to their mother. He believes that at this stage they're both not yet sexually differentiated, and that they both have share a single libido, which is masculine in nature. It is only after both children, male and female, go through the Oedipal stage that they can be said to have different genital associations, as we just discussed in the previous section. So Freud kind of posits that the Oedipal stage is an important phase of psychic development, leading to the development of sexually differentiated subjects. The femininity comes about as a result of the psychic development for Freud, for a girl, and it is not something she is born with. So it is like, it is being developed, like the psychic development is happening, and that's how the construction of woman is taking place. Whereas for Simone de Beauvoir, she seems to, she points out that it is believed that a woman is like a man, uh, is a human being, and but such an assertion is abstract. The fact that every concrete human being is uniquely situated, she portrays that the reality in reality, humanity is defined in masculine characteristics, and it is the man in turn who describes the woman. So she says that that this leads to the man being the absolute or the subject, and the woman relegated to being the other. So she's saying that a woman is not born but made, but in the society, in a social domain, she's being made and she's being termed as an other by her. So the construction of woman as an other lies at the foundation of Beauvoir's understanding of womanhood. The relationship of reciprocity which never existed between the sexes, and as society has been male, and it is men who describe a woman as the eternal other. So thus Beauvoir concludes that that one is not born but rather becomes a woman, and hence the construction of the woman takes place socially. The category of men being treated as the one and the most powerful and subjective that looks down upon women and terms them as the other. So therefore, if you look closely, both Freud and Beauvoir over here, they seem to agree that a woman is not born but rather made. Whereas, like, certain social or psychical factor play a crucial role in the creation of a woman rather than biological ones. So for Freud, it is a psychical factor which plays an important role in, constructing a woman in the society. Whereas for Simone de Beauvoir, she's talking about the social factor. So both Freud and Beauvoir seem to be interested in the process of how one becomes a woman, though the process is different for both of them. Moving to the next heading under Freud and Simone de Beauvoir, the birth of femininity. So when we looked at it, and as I discussed in the section femininity, like the Freud proposes that only a single masculine, he believes that only a single masculine libido is active in both boys and girls until the phallic stage of sexual development. And he depicts that until the libido's elemental stages, the sexual distinction is not possible. So, according to him, that the castration complex plays an important role for both boys and girls, but it routes a different course for both of them. So, for a boy, there's a clear differentiation concerning his Oedipal and pre-Oedipal phases, and from the beginning, his growth is more coherent and linear. Whereas for girls, the Oedipal phase does not occur similarly, and the relationship with her mother remains as an effective, unsettling constituent in her mind. So, as a result of the castration conflict, the girl assumes that everyone has a single form of genitals, penis, and succumbs to penis envy. The lack of penis makes her feel like a mutilated man, leading her to believe that she cannot win over her mother, and in this, in turn, redirects her to the father. Therefore, in a way, Freud terms both girls and boys appropriately as little men until the pre-Oedipal phase, as they are understood only through the solo lens of masculine libido. When we look at Simone de Beauvoir in this context, she contends that Freud seems to accept that woman's sexuality is as developed as man's, but he does not seem to be very concerned with woman's destiny, as his entire description of femininity appears to be based on a masculine model. That's what Simone de Beauvoir points out, and she does not agree with Freud and denounces his idea of the libido being initially only masculine, as according to her, it refuses to posit the feminine libido in its originality. Beauvoir further disagrees with Freud's idea of additional suppression to abolish a part of infantile masculinity in females to prepare her for the transformation in the genital zone. So Beauvoir kind of differs from Freud in his view that a girl feels like a mutilated man and feels inferior to males due to their anatomical superiority. Rather, she is of the opinion that that the inferiority stems from social positioning and power practiced by males in society. She says that a girl's envy seems to be a result of a prior valorization of virility. Freud seemed to be taking it for granted, and instead he should account for it. Freud seems to be an advocate of the idea of a single masculine libido up until the Oedipal phase, and women identifying as mutilated men as a result of the castration complex. Beauvoir, on the contrary, outrightly seems to disagree with Freud on there being a single masculine libido. She also criticized him for not considering the role in the suppression of women played by social implications and the power enjoyed by men because of the value placed in virility. So I could say, like, to conclude this section, that, when examined through the prism of these two key ideas, construction of a woman and birth of femininity, it becomes apparent that there seems to be a deep chasm between the theories of Freud and Beauvoir on the concept of the development of femininity in a woman. Beauvoir accused Freud's theory of understanding the coming about of femininity in a woman based on a masculine model. However, they are also somewhere similar, as both Freud and Beauvoir seem to be interested in the process of how one becomes a woman, though the process is different for both of them. On one hand, Freud sort of emphasizes that femininity comes about as a result of the psychic development of a girl and is not something she's born with. On the other hand, Beauvoir blames culture and society, as according to her, construction of the woman takes place socially. Having compared the theories of Freud with those of Beauvoir now, I'll move on to the next thinker, which is Freud and Luce Irigaray. And when I tried to read both of them, I read them under two subheadings. The first one is the little girl or little boy. So now the variance which we have just discussed between Freud and Beauvoir's concepts kind of broadens, when compared to the views of Luce Irigaray. So on one hand, where Freud proposes that both the boy and the girl child share common masculine libido until they enter the Oedipal phase. On the other hand, Irigaray proposes that since Freud could not perceive any other perspective, his viewing young girls sharing common libido with boys only results in them being seen as defective men. So, like, the first heading is the little girl a little boy? So, according to Freud, until the pre-Oedipal phase, both boys and girls develop similarly, and after entering the phallic stage, they both start attaining sexual gratification from their phalluses. The phallus is the penis for a boy and the clitoris for a girl. Though a girl is yet to discover her vagina, which occurs during puberty, leading to orgasmic pleasure for her, the entry to the phallic stage signifies that the pleasure is being derived by the phallus, penis for boys and clitoris for girls, leading to Freud's claim that the girl is a little man, as she uses with the same intent as a little boy, her still small clit, which is a penis equivalent. The clit of a girl is seen as an equivalent to a boy's penis during the phallic stage, and a girl is a little man by Freud. Well, Luce Irigaray does not seem to agree with Freud's description of girls in the phallic stage and points out that the problem lies within the name of this stage of psychosexual development. She says that, according to her, the phallic stage denotes that pleasure is being derived from a phallus. But since phallus itself, as the term denotes, a male sexual organ, why is this stage considered necessary for the development of female sexuality? That's what the question she raises. And she argues that Freud seems determined to observe male and female sexuality through the single lens of masculinity, as a consequence of which he views little girls as little men. Irigaray somewhere also argues that since the phallic stage does not seem to delve into the sexuality of a girl fully, then why does Freud describe this stage as a necessary step? And she also wonders, like, why is it a necessary step in becoming a normal woman? She contends that even if Freud deems it as an important stage, why does he not include the other important stages? For example, a vulvar stage, a vaginal stage, or a uterine stage in a discussion of female sexuality. She claims that Freud's theory of sexual development does not seem to include anything which falls outside masculine parameters. Irigaray, in disagreement with Freud, underlines that all the descriptions given of female sexuality by him seem to retain only those parts that correspond to the representation have of man may have of sexual desires. Therefore, his views on women's sexuality seem to be inadequate as they are formed up under the lens of masculinity. So, therefore, one could conclude that Freud seems to consider the phallic stage as one of the important stages for both boys and girls, and therefore stood little girls and little men during this stage. Luce Irigaray, however, does not seem to agree with him, as according to her, Freud seems to adopt a very narrow perspective, which does not have any room for a unique feminine sexual identity. He reduces the female experience to a defective version of the male equivalent, according to Luce Irigaray. Moving on to the next heading, the castration complex. So, here, according to Freud, in the Oedipal phase, a boy faces the castration complex and begins to identify with his father, and is the end of the Oedipus phase for him. Whereas for the girls, the castration complex of penis envy leads to the start of her Oedipus complex, as the initial love object for a girl is her mother. But since the mother cannot provide her with a penis, she turns to her father. So, Irigaray finds this castration complex problematic for girls, as according to her, a woman's castration is defined as her having nothing you can see, as her having nothing to be seen as equivalent, in a way to having nothing. So the emphasis has only been or always been only on the penis as an ideal sex organ. And when a girl discovers it visually that she does not have a penis, it leaves her somewhere with a sexual void, which is more like an actual castration. So the impact it leaves on a girl's mind is immense, and it seems to last for a long time as she finds it difficult to accept the penis loss and keeps waiting for it to grow and believes in that possibility for improbably long years. The girl internalizes a sense of being incomplete in absence of a penis, which eventually manifests itself in her seeking direction from men in her life according to their desires and laws, the first being her father. In conclusion, Irigaray says that that when Freud looks at a woman, he does not value the woman's inherent bodily qualities, but only sees it as a flat mirror which reflects the male body. The female sexuality for Freud seems to be only an imitation of its masculine counterpart, as he fails to appreciate the differences between both sexes. Thus, the concept of the castration complex is central to Freud's concept of sexuality. However, when comparing Freud's views with that of Irigaray, we get the sense that that the latter does not seem to sort of agree with Freud's views in the said concept. She considers it to be problematic because Freud seems to value the male sexual organ more, and he employs a very ocular-centric approach. So that's how I concluded Freud and Luce Irigaray. Moving on to the next thinker, Freud and Judith Butler. So when both Judith Butler and Sigmund Freud seem to believe that gender is not something that is naturally given at birth, but is constructed. However, they do differ in their notions of construction and nature of gender identities, as well as many other theories, which we'll be discussing in this section. So the first heading is construction of gender. So as we have discussed it, for Freud, the gender of an individual is not something that he is born with. Rather, the classification depends on the identification of child with his mother or father. Freud believes that this is a process that shapes gender identities. Judith Butler attacks the notion that gender and sex can be distinguished and holds that both these categories are socially constructed. So for Judith Butler, she says that that gender and sex both are socially constructed. She advances that sex is not a separate category on which gender is constructed. Rather, both these categories are interwoven. So Butler challenges the notion that gender is an opposite set of categories belonging to male and female bodies. Rather, she argues that masculinity and femininity are artificial characteristics that have to be performed by individuals and are not linked to sex. She explains the performance of gender identity as wearing clothes and that an individual can pick and choose. Therefore, men can perform feminine roles and women can be masculine. According to Butler, the distinction between sex and gender serves the argument that whatever biological intractability sex appears to have, gender is socially constructed, hence, gender is neither the causal result of sex nor is seemingly fixed as sex. Well, to this, Butler also adds that if this distinction between sex and gender is accepted, then it would lead to a radical discontinuity between sex bodies and culturally constructed gender. So, therefore, Butler clearly posits that we cannot impose gender on a person based on birth, and a man can be as easily feminine as a woman can be masculine, and an individual can play a role of being masculine or feminine based on their preference. So, on one hand, where Freud poses that gender is constructed and not what is given at birth, the formulation of gender identity for him depends on whether a child identifies with his mother or father, as an individual is born with both male and female dispositions within him. On the one hand, Butler also advances the notion that gender is constructed, but it is social. Gender for Butler is something which is repeatedly performed by an individual as per their liking and is not linked to sex. And a man can very well perform feminine roles, whereas a woman can perform masculine roles. Moving on to the next heading, internalization and identification of gender. So, well, our hypothesis of Freud's was that that a child derives pleasure from various bodily objects until he reaches the phallic stage. In other words, they are polymorphously perverse. Freud believes that the first of those pleasures experienced by an individual is a satiation of hunger. A newborn child performs this act by sucking on the mother's breast. The first object of desire for a child is the mother. But this is only the beginning of the development of an individual's desire that are sexual in nature. The object goes through many shifts without any particular destination. This shifting eventually leads the child to the Oedipus complex. It is only when this Oedipus complex is resolved that an individual's sexual desire comes to a normative or even non-normative culmination. So, a consequence of the shift of a child's object of desire away from their parents is that he or she begins to identify with either one of them. So, Freud postulates that it is not necessary for a child to choose one of either male or female objects. They have the potential to be attracted to both. According to Freud's theory, the masculine element within the child is responsible for a child desiring the female objects, while male objects are desired as a consequence of the feminine equivalent. Eventually, it is common for the boy to identify with his father. For a girl, it's more common to identify with the mother. Rarely does the child identify with the parent of the opposite sex, but it does occur. So Freud asserts that it is the identification of the child with the parent of the same sex, though that is a natural pattern of disposition, but he doesn't elaborate further on this. He hasn't talked much about this. Whereas, according to Butler, there is no proof of existence or explanation of dispositions, and arriving at them is not possible. She maintains that it is impossible to ascertain that certain masculine and feminine dispositions exist at the time of birth. Also, in her argument, she claims that an individual adopts previously missing gender elements, be it masculine or feminine, through a process of internalization and identification. But since these elements, which are constructed, are indiscernible from what Freud calls a natural disposition, it's kind of hard to distinguish which, facet of one's gender identity arise from the disposition and which is internalized to experience. So Butler builds further on her argument and and deduces that perhaps these gender dispositions are a byproduct of the internalization and identification process. It is so Butler kind of reasons that that since there is no evidence to confirm the existence of natural dispositions of gender, and neither is there a way to ascertain what can be considered natural and what cannot, it is reasonable to assure that through these dispositions might exist. They are not natural per se. So she deduces that perhaps these gender dispositions are a byproduct of the internalization and identification process. So in a way, we can say that Butler is kind of concluding, like she's stating that we perceive to be that what we perceive to be dispositions are a result of sequence of internalizations. And Freud somewhere kind of argues that when a boy successfully diverts his desire away from his mother, he compensates for that loss by developing a sense of identity that is concurrent with that what is of his father. So we could say that that Butler as well. So that the boy, according to Freud, that the boy makes this choice. According to Freud, it is a consequence of his natural disposition, but he gives no explanation as to what this disposition is. Butler, on the other hand, finds no evidence that it exists either. She claims that the fact that Freud himself suggests that he has no way to describe the disposition holds her hypothesis. So, this brings me to the conclusion of this chapter. So, while I try to analyze Freud's theories on desire and sexuality along with those feminist thinkers chosen for my study, Beauvoir, Luce Irigaray, and Judith Butler, we observe similarities as well as dissimilarities in their views. While comparing the views of Simone de Beauvoir with Freud, we talked about the construction of a woman, and we talked about the birth of femininity, and when we talked about Luce Irigaray, we talked about the significant ideas like is the little girl, a little boy. When we talked about Judith Butler and Freud, we talked about how the construction of gender or the internalization and identification of it takes place. So I believe that when I try to position Freud in one of the realms of essentialism or anti-essentialism, it can be said that Freud is an essentialist in a psychoanalytic sense. Freud exclusively stresses on the psychic when analyzing sexual differentiation between the two sexes. His theories can be said to support the essential view of feminism. Well, I could say that this chapter in my work has given me an in-depth examination of the complexities of Freud's position on infantile sexuality, the theory of desire, and the concept of femininity. And we could see Freud's position on sexuality from the point of view of desire, and along with the feminist thinkers. So, thank you so much. This is my presentation is only until this. I'm concluding my presentation now, and the floor is open for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mittal, for this very interesting presentation. I now request Aditi to please moderate the Q&A session. Is Aditi here?
She's in just a minute in the chat box.
Yeah. I think in the meanwhile, those who have questions can raise your hand or type your question in the chat box.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, you are. Yes.
Okay.
Yes, you are.
Thank you, Ms. Palak Mittal, for such a great talk. Now the floor is open for question and answers or discussions. You can ask the questions directly by raising your hand, or you can type the question in the chat box.
And if like, in case you want to give any feedback, if you feel that there are some points which I missed, or there's something I can add to my work or make it a little better, if you have any readings to recommend, anything of that sort, any comments are most welcome. So please, I'm kindly requesting you to please, if you do not have questions, please feel free to give your comments. Yeah. So I think Uday Kumar has raised his hand. Yeah.
You can go ahead and mute yourself and ask the question, Mr.
Yes, you did. Aditi, I can't hear him, or I don't know.
No, no one can hear it. Mr. Uday Kumar, if you can unmute yourself. Okay, we can go ahead, and if someone else has any questions or discussions, you can raise your hand or put it in the chat box. Any questions, discussions, suggestions? If you have any questions, further discussions, you can, we'll put the email in the chat box and you can contact Ms. Palak Mittal directly. If there are no further questions, I invite back Sia. Over to you.
Thank you, Aditi. Uh, I would like to invite Rajvi to deliver the vote of thanks.
Thank you, Sia. On behalf of the philosophy program of School of Sanskrit, Philosophy and Indic Studies, I extend my heartfelt gratitude to esteemed speaker for the insightful session on Freud and feminism. We appreciate your time and acknowledgement. I would also like to thank the Dean of the school, Professor Kushit Harakan, as well as the faculty members of the school for your support and encouragement to organize this talk. I want to express my sincere thanks to the research scholars of SSPIS for the effort and dedication you put into organizing this lecture. My special thanks to all the students, research scholars, faculty colleagues, and all the participants from and outside Goa University for your active participation. Thank you, Anand.